Education is supposed to be the great equalizer here in the United States, but it's becoming less and less likely that if you were born in a bad socioeconomic status, you're going to somehow climb up an economic ladder. So just to give you a few examples, researchers at the University of Michigan found that the imbalance between rich and poor children in college completion, the single most important predictor of success was actually what your socioeconomic status was. In fact, the important predictor of success in the workforce has grown by about 50% since the late 1980s. When it comes to spending on education in the U.S., in 1972, Americans at the upper end of the income spectrum were spending 5 times as much per child as low-income families. By 2007, that gap had widened to 9-to-1. Spending by upper-income families more than doubled, while spending by low-income families only grew by 20%. So this is a really big issue, and it seems as though quality education is kind of reserved for the wealthy, because now that public education is being defunded, more and more wealthy people are putting their students into private schools, so public schools continue to deteriorate. And on top of that, education beyond grade school, higher education is becoming more and more expensive. Tuition is becoming more and more expensive. So people that are from a lower socioeconomic status are less likely to go to college as a result of that. So lots of really big issues here. And Brendan, I want to start off with you. What do you think the long-term ramifications will be if this current system we have in place continues?
Well, I mean, I think that the long-term ramifications are exactly what you pointed out. A two-tiered education system in which students in wealthy districts have a high quality of education and students in less affluent communities have really very little resources on which to rely in their education.
Yeah, it is a really huge problem, because there's always this argument made, usually by right-wingers in the country, that if you don't succeed in life, if you don't have a successful career, it's because you're lazy. But there are other factors at play here, right, Dave?
Yeah, of course. And look, I'm a big believer that the government has basically 3 things to do. They have to protect us, so I guess we need an army and some firemen and a police department, and we need roads, and then they have to educate us. You know, those are pretty much the big 3 in my eyes. And to me, the socioeconomic angle of this, it benefits everybody when everyone's educated. So it's not like if you just keep the high income people educated and them getting more education and college educated and beyond that, that somehow that's going to benefit everybody. But if everyone is educated, we'll have a more thoughtful society that will be able to critically think and hopefully make decisions that will better everybody. So this is an everybody issue. This isn't a money issue.
So John, you know, there's a really interesting model that you can take a look at in Finland, right? So Finland had an education system that was completely falling apart. They were doing standardized testing, and they found that their students weren't achieving very much. And so they were really worried about this, and they decided, you know what, we need an entire overhaul of what we're doing with education. So they got rid of private education, and they forced wealthy people to put their kids in public schools. And as a result, there was much more investment in public education, and everyone was kind of lifted from that bad education system. Everyone started achieving great things. Do you think that that's a model that would succeed here in the U.S.?
I think that something like that could possibly succeed. I think that it's difficult to take a look at Finland and think that there's a lot that's very much like the United States. I mean, just demographically, historically, culturally, all that. But I do think that we have a version of that in our past, not from banning private schools, but just massive investment in public schools over the course of the past 200 years or so. And it did have that effect. You know, it raised the general level of education significantly just over the past 100 years. And I think that we read the article, I believe it was in Solana, about how you're bad if you send your kids to private schools. I don't know if I would go that far. But I do think that we can do more than just raising the level of funding to get people to do better in public schools. I think that whether you have access to a particular textbook or to a particular teacher means less in the modern day, when most of the textbooks can be found online and most of the teachers' lectures can be found online. Many Harvard, Princeton, Yale classes are available online. I think that we fundamentally need to teach kids to want to learn. We need to teach them the tools that come before calculus and geometry and biology and all those things. And I think that those are not that difficult or costly to teach compared to calculus, geometry, and biology. And I don't know exactly how we do that, but I think that if we teach kids to want to learn, if we give them role models like, say, Bill Nye the Science Guy or Neil deGrasse Tyson, as opposed to Miley Cyrus and LeBron James or whatever, then I think that they can do well, because basically every piece of information you could want to know is available freely on the internet, so long as you have internet access.
LeBron James is not going to be happy being thrown in there with Miley Cyrus. That is not doing that man justice.
Well, look, that's a fair point to make, but then you kind of get into psychology a little bit, right? So is intellectual curiosity something that's inherent? Is it something that's taught by society? I'm sure it's a mix of both, but unfortunately we don't have any data to prove one way or another right now in front of me. There might be a study out there.
I would imagine there is.
But I do agree with you that there are a number of things that are distracting kids from learning. But when you have wealthy people who have access to preschool, for instance, right? And in a lot of cases, that type of education costs more money. It's not free. Daycare is not free. So they have more hours of education under their belt before they actually start grade school. So they're already at a significant advantage. And what do you do to level things out, Brendan? Like, is there a solution to that issue, especially if, you know, making all private education illegal is not really a reality for the U.S.?
Well, I think, you know, to get to the root cause, one of the things that you have to do is really look at the source of funding in public education. And funding comes largely from either federal, state, or local sources. And the majority of funding does come from local sources in the form of property taxes, which causes massive disparities based on where a student lives. So a student who lives in a more affluent community gets much greater funding because of the property values in the town in which they live, compared to a student in a less affluent community who has much fewer resources being generated towards their public school. And it causes a direct impact on the quality of education there. So equalizing funding, I think, would be a great start. And in California, we're lucky to have an equality of opportunity model. So in Serrano v. Priest, the California Supreme Court overturned our local property tax-based system. And then the legislature enacted a law that honestly didn't quite get to those inequities. But now we have the local control funding formula, which our hope is that will directly address the needs of high-need students. So it provides, in addition to the base grants that all schools receive on an equal basis, or all districts receive on an equal basis, it provides supplemental grants for each English language learner student, foster youth, or low-income student. And it also provides concentration grants to schools that have high proportions of those types of high-need students.
Dave, do you see this going beyond just funding? There is an argument made by a lot of conservatives that public education is falling apart because a lot of the educators aren't qualified to do what they're doing. The unions are keeping them there, they're tenured, and as a result they can do whatever they want. They can totally fail these students, and as a result they get to keep their jobs.
You've obviously been watching a lot of O'Reilly, because that's what he does.
That's the type of argument he would make.
Every night the unions and these teachers are awful and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Look, we have to partly get some of the status out of this, and this is what you alluded to earlier. So I used to live on the Upper West Side in New York, which is a pretty well-to-do area. I was in a rent-stabilized apartment, just throwing that out there. But what they used to do, so you'd have an upper middle-class area with parents that could afford private schools, and they would send them all out of the area, and then all the local schools on the Upper West Side, they would have lower income kids going to the public schools. So partly it's just status. It's that if these people have money, well then they believe they should send them to private schools. So you have to change the whole dynamic, and we should have schools that are mixed. You shouldn't have rich people going to one school and poor people going to one school and middle class people. We can have a mix, and that's how you also form a healthy society, because when these people get out of school, they might interact with people that have different amounts of money than they do.
So when it comes to socioeconomic diversity, some people would argue that, hey, you know what, there is that achievement gap. It certainly does exist. And if you have a mix of people from different backgrounds in one school, those from a lower socioeconomic status are going to keep those from a higher socioeconomic status down when it comes to education. Because at that point, the teacher has to deal with 32 students, and she can't have customized curriculum for each student based on where they come from and, you know, what their background is. So John, do you see any type of solution to that issue? And do you see that as a real issue?
Well, I still think that that's a better solution than the current system. In the current system, she doesn't have time to deal with all the students, but she also doesn't have resources because the tax base from all those poor families doesn't provide them with money to have teachers' aides and things like that. Yeah, you might have somewhat of a time crunch with a mixed school, but you'd also have the higher tax base from the relatively well-off families, raising, I guess, the average amount of money that can go into a class. I think that's a possibility. I do want to say one thing that I saw in our supplementary reading that we were doing for this segment was they showed that as the achievement gap has been increasing between well-off and less well-off families, it has actually been decreasing between white and black families. And I thought that that was incredibly interesting. I certainly wouldn't have guessed that that was the case. But one thing that I'm probably going too far by assuming that this might even happen, but we've had a big problem in America where you haven't had the sort of open class conflicts that you have seen in a lot of other countries. And one of the reasons you don't see that historically in America is because the poor Americans have been very easy to distract along racial lines, religion lines, now homosexuals, Muslims, and things like that. But if poor whites are doing as badly as poor blacks, then maybe that can help to erase some of the ease with which the wealthy Americans can distract us.
That's a great point. I think that the conversation needs to shift away from race and more towards socioeconomic status, because that is the #1 predictor. And I like that. I like that it's no longer about whether you're a minority. It's more about, you know, how much money your family makes, whether or not
everybody's getting screwed. Whether
or not your mom is a single parent. And I guess the silver lining to everyone getting screwed is all of a sudden you have more of an incentive to try to reform the system. Now, I want to move on to higher education and how it's becoming more and more difficult for people to have access to that. But before we get to it, I just want to make a quick point about what's happening in Louisiana. So you're seeing Republicans take money out of the public school system, and they're funding vouchers for parents who want to send their children to private schools. Now, this might sound awesome on the surface, but the reality is they're trying to destroy the public education system so they can point to it and be like, oh, look at that, they're failing. Well, yeah, you're defunding them and then you're putting money into private schools. At the same time, okay, so you're giving people that might not be able to afford private schools these vouchers, so all of a sudden they can send their kids there. But do you think Republicans are going to keep giving poor people vouchers for private education? Hell no. You can see how the model is going to change. If they do away with public education and you only have a private model in the state, well, you're kind of screwed if you don't have the money to pay for that grade school tuition. Now let's fast forward to education for people who want to go to college, right? And so if you look at the numbers, it's really, really scary. According to a recent analysis, the overall cost of tuition and fees at public four-year colleges or universities, adjusted for inflation, has risen 350% since 1979 and almost 200% since 1999. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to go to college if they can't afford it. So what will the ramifications of that be? Because the job market is incredibly competitive, and if you have a high school diploma, what's your chance of getting a good job, Brendan?
I mean, honestly, I haven't looked at the statistics, but I'd imagine it's quite minimal. You know, as you were saying, the pricing of higher education is pricing out people at lower socioeconomic levels. And, you know, just to get a job at Starbucks these days, sometimes they're asking to see an undergraduate degree.
It's amazing. It's so incredible.
Some of those orders are really complicated, though.
They are. I worked as a barista at Coffee Bean, and I remember you got to get the powder, the right amount of milk. You got to get a college education for that.
What class in college was that they taught you how to do that again?
Barista 101. Yeah. Mixology. Oh, I love the phrase mixology.
We hugely, you have to support the public schools, of course. I went to SUNY Binghamton, State University of New York. At Binghamton, there is, especially in New York, there is a great system of public schools. They are crucially important because I wanted to go to Syracuse, actually, because I wanted to be a broadcaster. Here I am. It's amazing. But Syracuse was going to cost, at that time, I think it was something like $25,000 a year. And the education that I got was something around $9,000 a year, and I got a perfectly good education. So it's hugely important that we don't phase out public funding for schools, and that people we need that base. You just need that base where everyone feels they can get to, because not everybody can afford the $25,000, and really I'm pretty sure that's closer to $40,000 now.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I have a similar story. I really wanted to go to USC after college, and I thought, you know, if you're going to succeed in media, you absolutely have to go to USC. And so Cal State Northridge was my backup school just in case I didn't get in. Well, USC refused to take any of the college credits or transfer any of the college credits I got while I was in high school. They wanted me to retake all those classes because they wanted me to pay for it. Tuition at that time was close to $35,000 a year. So Cal State Northridge was like, hey, I know we're a public school and I know that you don't think that we're as great as USC, but you can come here, we'll pay for your education, you'll get a scholarship. And I made that decision. It was the best decision of my life. But the reality is people don't have that access anymore. It's so expensive to go to that school at this point. I feel bad for people.
Yeah. And Barista 101 worked out for you.
It did, it really did.
Yeah.
John?
Yeah, well, I think, look, I host a college, YouTube show or whatever. I love everything about the traditional on-campus 4 to 7 year undergraduate life that people have. I want people to be able to have that. I want them to live in dorms and everything. But all of that is incredibly expensive, and apparently the powers that be have decided that that's not going to be an option anymore, and they're just going to keep jacking up the prices. So it might be that in the future we do have to transition to a larger focus on online education and things like that. I know, like Lisa, my co-host, is taking Coursera courses right now. Now, unfortunately, we don't currently have a system in place where you can easily take online classes and get a reputable degree out of it, really. But, the world's not what it was 10 years ago, and perhaps in another 10 years, it won't seem so weird that if you can take the tests and show that you learn the material, like there's no reason why we should be paying for these massive brick buildings and quads and things like that if the education doesn't need to cost that much if you can do it online.
Yeah, and by the way, when it comes to higher ed, there are two issues at play that impact tuition. So one thing is, all right, since it's a public institution, a lot of states have defunded those institutions as well, and the administrators need to make up that revenue. And the way that they do it is they jack up the prices for the students. But another thing is they want their school to seem desirable, so they keep building those buildings and they keep adding programs that seem glitzy and glamorous.
Rock climbing.
Things like that. And then before you know it, they also transfer those costs off to students as well. So those two issues are huge and they should be addressed, but unfortunately we're out of time for this topic. But I hope it got you guys thinking about what's happening with education in the country. Again, it's supposed to be the great equalizer. We're supposed to have opportunity for everyone here, but it's just not the case if it's becoming less and less accessible to those from a lower socioeconomic status.